Hey family, King Kurus here, your Black History buff. Today, we're embarking on a journey not just through the streets of the UK, but through time. We're going to unpack some of the race riots that have been shaking the UK in 2024. But to understand today, we need to look back, and I mean way back. So, grab a brew, get comfortable, and let's walk and talk about how we got here. Now, before we dive in, let me be clear, this isn't going to be a short stroll. We're covering over a century of history here, and every bit of it matters. It's not just about dates and events, it's about understanding the threads that connect our past to our present. We're talking about legacies that have shaped the lives of Black African, West Indian, Asian and Muslim communities in the UK. So let's start at the beginning of the 20th century. It's 1919. World War I has just ended and Britain was in a shambles. The country needed rebuilding, and guess who they called? That's right, workers from the West Indies and Africa. But here's the kicker. As soon as these black and minority workers arrived, all hell broke loose. In port cities like Liverpool, Cardiff and London, we saw some of the first race riots of the 20th century. White mobs, angry about job competition and fueled by post-war recession, went on the rampage. In Liverpool, a black man named Charles Wotton was chased by a white mob and drowned in the Mersey River. Let that just sink in for a moment. A man lost his life simply because of the color of his skin. These riots weren't just violence for the sake of it. They exposed the deep racial tensions bubbling under the surface of British society. And you know what? They set a pattern that we'd see repeating throughout the century, affecting not only black communities, but also South Asian and other minority groups as they began to arrive in the UK in larger numbers. Fast forward to 1948. The HMT Empire Windrush docks at Tilbury, bringing 492 passengers from the Caribbean. This wasn't just a ship arrival, it was the beginning of a new chapter in British history. But let's broaden our lens here. This wasn't just about Caribbean migration. Around the same time, people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh were also arriving in the UK, contributing to the nation's rebuilding efforts. Now, let's get something straight. These men and women weren't just coming on a whim. They were invited by the British government to help rebuild the country after World War II. The UK needed workers, and it turned to its colonies for help. These people, many from Jamaica, other Caribbean islands and South Asia, came with hope and a willingness to contribute. But here's where things get messy. Despite being invited, these newcomers weren't given British passports. They were told they had the right to remain in the UK indefinitely. But this lack of formal documentation would come back to haunt them and their children decades later. Remember this point, family. It's going to be important, not just for the Windrush generation, but for others too. The 1950s rolled round and tensions were rising. In 1958, we saw the Notting Hill and Nottingham riots. Imagine this, white mobs attacking black residents over several nights in London and Nottingham. But the hostility wasn't just towards black people. It extended to South Asians as well, who were viewed as economic competitors and cultural outsiders. Now, let me share something personal. One of my earliest memories is from a later era, but it connects to this long history of tension. I remember, as a child, seeing petrol bombs fly past my house during the Brixton riots in the 80s. I was just a child, and this is one of my earliest memories, and the image is seared into my mind. I remember standing at the window, looking outside and calling over to my mum, saying, "Look, Mum, fireworks, fireworks," as I saw these orange flames shoot through the sky and explode up and down the street. And I remember my mum dragging me away from the window and pulling me towards the back of the house. And it was only years later, when I was able to reflect on it, that I realized that this key memory of mine, this early memory of mine, was my first taste of the violence that can erupt when racial tensions boil over. But before we get into the 80s, we need to talk about 1968. Enter Enoch Powell, a Conservative Member of Parliament. On April 20th, Powell gave a speech that would change the course of race relations in the UK. It's commonly known as the Rivers of Blood speech. Powell, speaking to Conservative Party members in Birmingham, warned against what he saw as the dangers of immigration. He predicted that continued immigration would lead to intercommunal violence. His most infamous line was, "Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much
Enoch
blood."
Powell was the most controversial of Tory politicians before Margaret Thatcher. His devotees claimed he was a man of unwavering principle. His detractors, that he represented the respectable face of gutter politics. The former Wolverhampton MP himself says that the thread which runs through his life is his belief in the nation.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Well, I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? My answer is that I do not have the right not to do so.
The speech was explosive. It tapped into the fears and prejudices that many British people held but hadn't expressed openly. Powell was dismissed from the shadow cabinet, but his words resonated with a significant portion of the population. And it legitimized racist views and had a lasting impact on British politics and society. It emboldened not just anti-black sentiments, but also anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, and anti-Jewish prejudices. The speech contributed to an environment of increased hostility towards immigrants. It fueled the rise of far-right groups like the National Front in the 70s, targeting immigrant communities with racist rhetoric and violence. But here's the thing, where there's oppression, there's resistance. The 70s and 80s saw the rise of the Anti-Nazi League and other anti-racist movements. These groups organized protests and demonstrations across the country, involving people from all walks of life, including Black, South Asian, and white allies. One of the most notable was the 1977 Battle of Lewisham, where thousands of anti-fascists clashed with the National Front in South London. This was more than just a protest. It was a clear message that the British public, in its diversity, would not tolerate fascism or racism. So, now let's talk about the 80s. 1981, Brixton, economic recession, high unemployment, and racial discrimination, particularly amongst the Black Caribbean community, created a powder keg. The spark? Operation Swamp 81, a police initiative using the controversial sus laws that were used to stop and search black youths with complete impunity. In April 1981, tensions erupted into violence after a young black man was injured while being stopped by the police. Rioting lasted for several days with widespread looting, arson, and clashes between the police and residents. I was just a kid then, but I remember the aftermath. I remember the tension in the air. I remember the burned out buildings. I remember seeing the turned over cars. I remember finding bullets on the road. And the sense, the whole vibe that something fundamental had shifted. And it had. The Brixton riots led to the Scarman Report, which finally acknowledged racial disadvantage and recommended reforms in policing and social policy. It was a turning point in race relations in the UK, highlighting the need for systemic change not just for black communities, but for all minorities facing discrimination. But change doesn't happen overnight. In 1985, we saw more unrest in Handsworth, Birmingham, and Broadwater Farm in London. 2 days of rioting in Handsworth resulted in 2 deaths and extensive property damage. In Broadwater Farm, riots broke out after a police raid led to the death of a black woman, Cynthia Jarrett. The violence escalated, resulting in the death of a police officer, PC Keith Blakelock. These events deepened the mistrust between the police and black communities and highlighted the failures of government policies to address racial inequality. The same year, in cities like Bradford, Asian communities were also mobilizing against similar police brutality and social neglect, showing that these struggles were interconnected across different minority groups. As we move into the 21st century, the face of racial tension in Britain was changing. The early 2000s saw racial tensions between white and Asian communities, particularly in northern towns like Bradford, Oldham, and Burnley. But let's not forget the underlying economic factors. Deindustrialization had hit these areas hard, leading to high unemployment and social disenfranchisement, which far-right groups exploited to stir racial division. In the summer of 2001, riots broke out in these towns. Clashes between Asian youths and white gangs, as well as confrontations with the police, resulting in significant violence and destruction. These riots prompted government inquiries which identified segregation and a lack of social cohesion as key issues. Now, I want you to notice something here. We're seeing a pattern. Economic hardship, social isolation, lack of opportunities. These factors keep coming up, and they don't just affect one community. They create a breeding ground for resentment, for scapegoating, for violence. Whether it's black, Asian, or white working class communities, the same systemic issues fuel these tensions. Fast forward to 2011, the death of Mark Duggan, a black man, in a police shooting in Tottenham, North London. This triggered widespread unrest. The riot spread across London and to other cities like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. These riots weren't solely about race, but they were fueled by broader issues of police brutality, economic inequality, and again, social discontent. Sound familiar? It should. Because these are the same issues we're grappling with today. And it wasn't just black communities affected. Muslim and South Asian communities were also in the crosshairs of growing Islamophobia and racism. So let's talk about some more recent events that have shaped where we are today. In 2018, we saw the Windrush scandal unfold. Remember the people I mentioned earlier who came to Britain in the 40s and 50s to help rebuild the country? Well, in 2018, it came to light that hundreds of them and their descendants had been wrongfully detained, deported, and denied legal rights. A Tory government, decades after inviting these people to help rebuild Britain, were now treating them as illegal immigrants. People who had lived and worked in the UK for most of their lives were suddenly told they didn't belong. It was a betrayal of the highest order, and it deepened the mistrust between minority communities and the government. Then, in 2020, we saw the global Black Lives Matter movement resonate strongly here in the UK. The murder of George Floyd in the United States sparked protests across Britain, highlighting our own issues with systemic racism and police violence. These protests weren't just about the black experience in the UK. They galvanized all the communities. We saw Asians, Muslim, and other communities come together to speak out against their own experiences of racism. These protests brought renewed attention to the UK's colonial legacy and its impact on Black and South Asian communities. They led to calls for significant reforms in policing, education, and public condemnation of Britain's colonial past. And that brings us to today, August 2024. We're witnessing some of the worst and largest scale racist violence in recent British history. It's not just some riots. Some people are calling these events pogrom, and with good reason. In towns and cities across England and even in Belfast, far-right mobs have unleashed chaos. They set fire to accommodation housing asylum seekers, laid siege to mosques, fought with police, looted shops, and damaged public buildings and private homes. And it's not just property damage. People are being hurt. Scores of individuals, mostly from Muslim and British Asian backgrounds, have been assaulted in the street. In Hull, a man was dragged from his car and beaten because of the colour of his skin. Now, you might be wondering, how did we get here? How did we reach a point where members of the English Defence League are roaming the streets burning things down? Well, it's a complex story, but we need to understand it to fight against it. This most recent unrest was triggered by misinformation following a stabbing incident in Southport. Far-right groups exploited the situation, spreading false information and conspiracy theories, particularly targeting Muslim communities. This disinformation spread rapidly on social media platforms, inciting anger and fear. But we can't just blame social media. Traditional media has played a significant role too. According to a 2024 report by the Runnymede Trust, the media has used dubious data and disproportionate coverage to manufacture exaggerated support for anti-immigration views. They might condemn the violence we're seeing now, but they've been fanning these flames for years. And what about our political leaders? Both major parties have been competing to sound tougher on migration. Instead of rejecting failed approaches, they've endorsed the underlying logic and used the same dehumanizing language. Studies have shown a direct link between this kind of rhetoric from politicians and increases in hate crimes and far-right activity. Now, some people might try to explain this away as economic anxiety. They'll say it's just the working class, impoverished and disenfranchised after years of austerity, lashing out. And sure, there's a correlation between economic inequality and the popularity of the far right, but it's not that simple. The relationship between class status and far right ideology isn't straightforward. While some of the people involved in these riots are working class, it would be a mistake to position the far right as a working class movement. Many of the people they're targeting are working class too. Fascism has always been a cross-class movement. Today, you'll find landlords, golf enthusiasts, people who holiday in Madeira, and even Broad Street journalists with double-barreled surnames amongst their ranks. And let's talk about this idea that it's all about high immigration. If you ask the rioters, that's what they tell you. But we don't have to take that at face value. The research shows that white people who live in multicultural, high immigration areas are less likely to hold racist or anti-migrant views. Take Tamworth, where people tried to burn down a Holiday Inn housing asylum seekers. It's 96% white. This isn't about numbers. It's about perceived cultural threat. What we're seeing didn't come out of nowhere. Islamophobia, racism, and far-right ideology have been intensifying in Britain for years. The rate of hate crimes has been incrementally increasing. It was only a matter of time before mass violence erupted. But here's the thing. Where there's oppression, there's resistance. Just as we saw the anti-Nazi League in the 70s and 80s, we're seeing anti-racist movements mobilized today. In response to the far-right riots, anti-racist groups have organized counter-protests to defend immigrant communities and oppose far-right violence. In cities like London and Liverpool, thousands of anti-racist demonstrators have taken to the streets, showing solidarity with targeted communities. Glasgow, known for its strong anti-fascist tradition, has also seen significant mobilization against racism. So where do we go from here? First, we need to recognize this for what it is. These aren't just riots or protests. They're targeted, organized, and vicious attacks on minority communities. We can't sugarcoat this or pretend it's anything less than what it is. Second, we need to address the root causes. That means tackling economic equality, yes, but also confronting the systemic racism that permeates our society. We need to hold our media and political leaders accountable for their role in stoking these flames. Third, we need to build solidarity across communities. The far right wants to divide us, but we're stronger together. We need to reach out to those who might be susceptible to these ideologies and show them a better way. And finally, we need to arm ourselves with knowledge. That's why I do what I do, family. When we know our history, when we understand how we got here, we're better equipped to fight for a better future. Remember, family, knowledge is power. And when we stand together, armed with that knowledge, we're unstoppable. These riots aren't just about race, they're about inequality, about a system that fails too many people for too long. Our fight isn't just for our rights, but for a fairer society for everyone. If you want to be part of this ongoing conversation, if you want to dive deeper into our history and how it connects to what we're facing today, I invite you to come and join my Patreon. Together, we can explore these issues, share our experiences, and work towards real solutions. We've briefly walked over a century of history today. From post-World War I riots to the echoes of Powell's speech, from the betrayal of the Windrush scandal to the riots we see today. We stand at a crossroads. The path forward isn't easy, but I believe in us. I believe in our strength, our resilience, and our capacity for change. Stay strong, stay proud, stay united, and remember, Black history is world history. Stay blessed.